This is the piece that John and I reached at the end of the last programme, namely Thousand Island Park from the Mahavishnu Orchestra album Birds of Fire. And unlike the fiery, rock-inflected sound that characterises so much of the Mahavishnu output, this reveals a softer side of John's work, focused on the acoustic guitar.
Thousand Island Park was already a reference to my own spiritual search, because Thousand Island Park was where a man called Vivekananda visited. And Vivekananda was a very pivotal figure for me in the early 70s. It still is today, but really to a great extent in those years. He was the disciple of Ramakrishna, who was a great saint, Indian saint, who had the two foremost disciples were Vivekananda and Brahmananda, and these two were very, very important people to me. Vivekananda really exemplified wonderful interior strength. And this is really where Thousand Island Park comes from. And this, of course, we have Jan playing acoustic piano, and Jerry's playing acoustic violin. It's a much more lyrical side. But this, I think, is part of the beauty of the acoustic instrument. It has a lyrical side. There's a much more energetic side to the electric music. Certainly, the Mahavishnu that people know, we were probably the loudest and fastest band ever.
We're going to stick with that label, but a very, very different band, and perhaps the one which, as much as Mahavishnu has become identified with you over the years, John, and that's Shakti. I mean, it's had various incarnations. I remember when the first album came out, and that's the one we're going to hear part of, there was again this kind of buzz of excitement that there had been about these other stages in your career. Because I think all of us who read The Melody Maker in those days would sort of open it up and there would be another story about you doing something else and something different. Now, maybe Miles is behind this as well, but perhaps this is a little different.
No, he wouldn't be behind this particular move. Where should I start? Because the origins of Shakti, you can probably trace them to the 1960s, where I discovered Indian philosophy, coming out of my hippie days and ceasing to drop tabs of LSD and trying to alter my state of consciousness through natural means, which I began to practice yoga from 1968 and try meditate, figure out who I was and what everything is in this gigantic mystery in which we all live. If you're interested in any kind of interior development, you will run into India. It's inevitable, because they've been considering the nature of existence for at least 5,000 years now, while we were still living in trees, or no, maybe mud huts. And it was actually the culture, the philosophical culture, that drew me to India in the first place. It was subsequently the music that I discovered. And the great thing about the music was, Indian music I'm speaking about, was that it's all inclusive, in the sense that all the different aspects or dimensions of the human psyche or personality are included in Indian music, from the most profound to the most humorous or capricious.
Lotus Feet from the very first Shakti album on Columbia, recorded live in 1975. And there's full personnel details on the Jazz Library website. That's www.bbc.co.uk/radio3/Jazz Library. But the key partnership in this band is between John McLaughlin and tabla player Zakir Hussain. And they met not long after John had come to New York to play with Tony Williams.
There was a music shop in Soho on Bleecker Street called Music of the World. They had the tampuras, the sitars, the tablas, very hippie kind of shop. Nice people. And I was there one day and I said, if ever you get an Indian mastered musician coming through, call me, because I want a lesson, any kind. So he called me up one day. He said, well, I've got somebody in here, but I'm not sure what kind of lesson he can give you. I said, well, he's a tabla player called Zakir Hussain. I said, well, ask him, can he give me a vocal lesson? And so he said, can you want to give him a vocal lesson? And he said, yes. So I went down to this music shop and Zakir Hussain gave me a vocal lesson. He sings slightly better than me, really not very well at all, but better than me. In any event, we had a lot of laughs. And after this little lesson, we became very good friends. In 1972, I became a student of Dr. Ramanathan, an extracurricular student where he was studying in Connecticut at Wesleyan University, teaching South Indian music. So I began studying South Indian Veena with him. And through him, I got to meet his mridangam player. Mridangam is a double-ended South Indian drum who accompanied my teacher. And I used to hang out there when I was free because there was lots of musicians, lots of Indian musicians, and it was great for me. And through his percussion player, called Ramnath Raghavan, I met his nephew, Dr. Shankar, who was also teaching South Indian music at Wesleyan University. He was a young guy, my age. And so we started to hang out together. He was a violinist. And I thought, oh, how nice, you know. And before long, we were hanging out and jamming together. And he was wonderful, absolutely wonderful violinist. And one day, I said to him, do you know Zakir Hussain? He said, well, I don't know. I know about him because Zakir was already a star in India. He was less well known in the West, but very well known in India. I said, well, you know, he's a really good friend. I think we should get together. Because I'd played once with Zakir by 1972. Because the Mahavishnu Orchestra had been invited by Clive Davis to do a benefit concert in Los Angeles. And he said, you can make the beneficiary anyone you like. So I said, well, I don't want to do it for myself, but I'll do it for the Ali Akbar Khan School of Music, where Zakir was teaching in Northern California. So we did the concert, and Zakir came, and this is the first time he'd heard me play with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and he really liked that. The following day, we flew up to San Francisco to meet Ali Akbar Khan Sahib, because he wanted to meet me and just say thanks. And so we went to his house, and I had an acoustic guitar, and Zakir had his tabla, and we sat down and played in front of Ali Akbar Khan Sahib, very pretentious Alyn, I know, but Khan Sahib was there with his whiskey and cigarette, blah, 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 blah. Wonderful, fantastic experience. And Zakir was astounding. And he still is. Today he astounds me 40 years later. So I knew what Zakir could do, and I knew what Shankar could do. And I said, you know, we have to get together. And this was around 1972, 73. So we got my teacher's mridangam player, South Indian. We got Zakir Hussain, North Indian, Shankar on violin, and this was really the birth of Shakti.
John McLaughlin spent much of the mid-70s touring with this band and playing a specially made guitar with sympathetic strings and a scalloped fingerboard. But in 1978, he released a CD that reminded us he was still a force to be reckoned with on the electric instrument. It was called Johnny McLaughlin, Electric Guitarist, and the cover featured a visiting card of him as a young boy with his address in Sunnyside, Yorkshire. I'd always assumed that this was just mocked up for the album cover.
It was a real card. Yes, I had it made. I think it was just for my little ego, just, you know, that I exist on a card as a musician. Because since I was 11 years old, it was my dream just to be a musician. That's really all it was.
Well, the album is a kind of statement of where you are on the electric instrument up to that point. I mean, there's a lot of different bits and pieces. There's sort of 3/4 of Lifetime, there's one or two other things. But the track that I've come back to again and again from that album is the duet with you and Billy Cobham. Seems to me that a lot of the discussion we've had has been about your relationship with percussionists one way or another. I mean, we've just talked about Zakir, we've talked about Tony Williams, we talked about going back to Tony Oxley, we talked about Jack to Jeanette. I mean, percussion and you seem to fit, and this duet is really a meeting of minds.
I love drums, and actually when I was in New York, I used to have a drum kit in my loft, and I used to be able to play. I gave that up when I moved out of America. But I have tremendous love of drums and rhythm generally. And Billy, of course, one of the most outstanding drummers of our time. And this piece actually relates also in a more oblique way to the Indian traditions where there's no harmony, there's no chords, there's just sometimes a drone, well, invariably a drone, and the soloist and accompanying percussionist. So we have a kind of Western version of that Spartan situation. But with Billy, it's very easy. But the title actually comes from a very inspiring American painter called Paul Jenkins, very fine, abstract kind of action painter. not in the Jackson Pollock school, a later school, but very fine work, great work. And I knew him at that period, and he was very inspiring. And in fact, the title came from one of his paintings that really knocked me out. He would get this canvas, and he'd balance it on a table, and he'd get a pot of paint, and he'd pour some paint on, then he'd start moving the canvas. It was already on a frame, and this is how he painted. And he would move the paint on the canvas in such a way. And I watched him paint. I mean, it was wonderful to see this creative side of things. It's so different from my world, but to see it in a visual sense. And I really wanted to keep it simple. And so just to have Billy and I, that was enough.
Phenomenon Compulsion, and that's from the album Johnny McLaughlin, Electric Guitarist, which is now out on a Japanese reissue from the PID label. Billy Cobham and John McLaughlin in 1978. We're going to move now to the 1980s and a disc which, the same way as Electric Guitarist, made some waves at the time. This is one that has quite a large cast of characters on it. The track we're going to hear actually features, amongst others, Bill Evans, not the pianist, but the saxophonist, and it's called Florianopolis. And this brings you back again, John, to the acoustic instrument.
It does. Just to bring it up to date in terms of electric acoustic form, by 78, which was, I think, the recording of Electric Guitarist, this was the end of the first era of Shakti, where I really wanted to move back into jazz playing, try to bring some of the things I'd learned from the Shakti years to integrate it. Really, I think this is the whole process of integration is what I've been trying to do. Because even you go back to the opening piece of A Meeting of the Spirits, you can hear the flamenco influence in a strange kind of way. But the flamenco music has been influencing me since I was 13 or 14. And I love flamenco music. And it was already there, this effect that it was having on me. So I'd come out of acoustic guitar in 78. By 84, which I think was the recording you're speaking about, the acoustic guitar was part of me. Actually, there was a group called the Translators, but much less known. I don't think there's a real recording of this group, which I was playing with a kind of an electric band, but playing acoustic guitar. With the final edition of Mahavishnu, I was playing electric guitar, but also, of course, this acoustic piece, Florianopolis, that came from this lovely city in Brazil of the same name. And really, in a way, it's kind of a reference to the admiration and affection that I have for Brazilian music that has been directly influencing jazz since the late 50s. You hear the recordings of Jobim with Stan Getz and this wonderful lyricism that's in Brazilian music, pieces that Paco de Lucia and I played subsequently in the guitar trio. I mean, this is really Brazilian music, but it's very close to jazz because of the harmonic content. So Florianopolis, in a way, was a reflection of that visit, one particular visit that I played in Florianopolis. It's such a nice name, Florianopolis, a flower city, so nice. It comes from my flower power days, Alyn, I think.
We're going to jump forward now 5 years from the mid-80s to just the beginning of the 1990s, and one of two trios with which you toured with the Indian percussionist Trilok Gurtu. This one has Dominique de Piazza on bass, and there was another one as well, I think, with
Kai Eckhart, yes.
Which played very memorably and recorded at the Royal Festival Hall in London. I've chosen the Que Alegria album because in some ways it seems to me this sees the process through a little bit longer, but I guess one could, if one was selecting an album, look at either of these two, because you and Trilok, again, we're back to you and percussionists, but it's an amazing partnership.
Yes, yeah, he truly was, because here we have, in a way, an Indian analog of myself, where you have a guy born in Bombay, growing up playing tabla, and then discovering Coltrane, Elvin Jones, and him being totally influenced by Western music and creating this new drum kit that he played on his knees, but in such an innovative way and in such an imaginative way. I'd never heard anyone play like Trilok. And he loved Tony. He loved all the drummers that I loved, Elvin and Tony in particular. But not only that, he had this stoned quality, if I this kind of 60s where he'd get a gong and hit it and dunk it in a bucket of water with a microphone next to it and give the most strangest, evocative sounds. I loved that. And we really got on very well together. And this trio was important for me for that reason, but for another reason. Again, I had access to a synthesizer guitar, which I'd been experimenting with since the Mahavishnu days, really from 1974. But there have always been problems with synthesizer guitar. There are still problems with synthesizer guitar. Less important, but we're still waiting as guitar players to have an instrument that can function as well as a keyboard, a synthesizer for a pianist. We still don't have it yet. But I'm still working on it because even my last record, actually 50% of the pieces I did with synthesizer guitar. So it's still this kind of love that I have for it. But what I liked about this particular trio with Trelock was that I was playing acoustic guitar, which has got this kind of antique atmosphere, contrasted directly with this modern kind of synth sounds. And with the way that Trelock played, and of course with Dominic Di Piazza or Kai Eckert, both wonderful bass players, this was a really wonderful trio, very coherent, lucid musically, that I thoroughly enjoyed playing with.
Que Alegria, the title track of John McLaughlin's 1991 trio album with Trelock Gurtu and Dominic Di Piazza. Both in the last programme and this one, John's talked about his affinity for percussionists. And one man whose name has come up several times in our conversation is Elvin Jones. In 1994, the two of them recorded together with organist Joey DeFrancesco on the Verve album After the Rain. In a moment, we'll hear Naima, a track which, like the title piece, has obvious Coltrane associations, just like Elvin himself.
When I called him to make this recording and he agreed, I was just thrilled. Because I love him. I grew up with him, and I've listened to thousands of hours of Elvin. He was a lovely man, just a beautiful, loving human being. And that's the way he played drums. And of course I had Joey DeFrancesco, who was with the Free Spirits, with Dennis Chambers, another amazing drummer, and myself, another organ trio. This was a kind of return to the roots again, Alan. But frequently I think we have to go a step backwards to make a step forwards. In any event, this was basically a double tribute, one to Coltrane and another to Elvin himself. It was a great experience. And we actually did a number of concerts in Europe, nothing in the UK, some live playing in addition to recording, and that was just outstanding. And Elvin, just a very brief anecdote, we were in the studio, we recorded in New York, but we would do a piece, and if it was great, the first take, we'd just keep that one. But there were a couple of pieces where we'd try several different takes, and there was one, we finished it, and Elvin got off his drums, and he ran across the studio. I mean, he must have been way into his 60s. He grabbed a hold of me, lifted me in the air, and it was just, like this, like I was some kid, you know. I mean, I'm 80 kilos. You know, he just picked me up and laughed at me. He was so joyful and so happy about that particular take that we had. I mean, what a man. Amazing.
Well, that's Naima from After the Rain on Verve. That's with Joe DeFrancesco on organ, Elvin Jones drums, and my guest John McLaughlin on guitar. This is Jazz Library with me, Alyn Shipman, and John McLaughlin, looking forward to John's appearance in the not-too-distant future at the London Jazz Festival. Well, John, we're going to come right up to date, actually, talking of the London Jazz Festival, to 2006. At least that's when the album Industrial Zen came out. I think it was recorded over a year ahead of that. But this finds you back with Bill Evans on saxophone, but the track we're going to hear for Jaco, partly very important because of your relationship with Jaco Pastorius, but also has some Brits on it, Gary Husband and Mark Mondesi.
Yes, indeed, who happen to be both in my current group. It's called The Fourth Dimension, with Mark on drums and Gary playing keyboards and drums, second drums. We played recently in London, a great concert we had there. And on bass, we have another European. It's not one American in this band. We have a young Frenchman called Hadrien Ferro, who is a very, very talented young man. When I wanted to record this piece for Jaco, I'd been thinking about him, and I missed him. I'd also recently just finished a mix of the recording that Jaco and Tony Williams and myself had done in Havana, 1979, I believe. I'm very happy to be able to have done that. In any event, I was missing Jaco, and I wrote this piece shortly after. And I heard this young bass player called Hadrien Ferro. We're going back a few years now, 4 years, something like this. I heard him play, and he was absolutely meant for this piece. And so I got him to record on this piece with Mark and Gary. And at the end, I don't know if you recognize it, because it's a feature for Hadrien. Not that he plays a solo, except at the very end, where it all changes. It becomes quite melancholy, because I miss him. I'm melancholy when I miss people. And the tune becomes melancholic. And I asked Hadrien, I said, just go where you want. You hear the harmony, just go with it. And he went, and at the very end, he made this little allusion to Jaco, because he loves Jaco. Da-da-do-dee, ba-da-do-dee, ba-da-da-da-dee-da-da. You hear it on the Trio of Doom. Jaco recorded it with Herbie, I think. And it just came out spontaneously. It was so poignant how he did it. It was really perfect. So, for Jaco, anytime.
Well, that's for Jaco from Industrial Zen on the Verve label, with Bill Evans, Gary Husband, Hadrien Ferro and Mark Mondesi, recorded in 2006 with John McLaughlin, my guest, on guitar. Well, John, we're almost at the end of the programme. We ought to have perhaps just a quick word before we come to our final album about the band that you're going to be playing with, because here you are back again with Chick Corea.
Yes, Chick, we go back a long time. And I've seen him already several times this year. He's one of the people that I've stayed in touch with over the years. Some people you don't see for years, and you're delighted to see them. I even have brothers like that. I don't write, he doesn't write, and then I see him after 3 or 4 years, and it's like I saw him yesterday. And there are lots of musicians like this. Chick, we write, we communicate frequently, we enjoy each other's music. And we've been speaking about this for a long time, and I think it's a very exciting, musically exciting project. I don't know how it will be commercially, but then I gave up thinking about that a long time ago. But we've got some great players in it. Kenny Garrett on alto sax, Christian McBride on bass, fantastic bass player, and of course Vinny Colaiuta, one of my old cohorts with whom I played last year at the Crossroads Festival with Eric Clapton. I did a recording with him with Sting quite a few years ago. He's wonderful. So I'm very excited about this. Just to come to this final piece, without being maudlin, it's a piece that I wrote for my wife, and it's called Maharina. This is a play on a Sanskrit word. Maharani means great queen. Mahavishnu, this is great Vishnu. Maha is a Sanskrit word for great. And this was done on floating point, and I'm using synthesizer guitar, but it's a ballad, and I'm able to play in a way that is very difficult, almost impossible. I would say impossible to play on electric guitar in the same way. And I really am happy at the way it came out, because it's very tender.
John, thank you very much indeed for being my guest on Jazz Library. And so, from Floating Point, we'll leave you with Maharina, and from John McLaughlin and me, good afternoon.